For 40 years, my family stayed silent. I thought that meant peace. I was wrong. Silence does not arrive loudly. It does not announce itself. It does not break things or leave visible damage behind. Silence enters the way dust does, slowly, gently, almost respectfully, until one day you realize it has settled into every corner of your life. I didn't notice it at first. That is the part one still struggle to forgive myself for. When something disappears gradually enough, you don't panic. You hesitate. You assume you missed it. And hesitation, I learned too late, is how silence survives. 40 years ago, this house was full. Not full of joy exactly, but full of order, structure, predictability. We believed those things meant stability. Breakfast at the same time every morning. Dinner at the same table, with the same chairs claimed by the same people, as if movement itself might disturb something fragile. My wife folded the napkins the same way each night, smoothing the creases with care. My brother-in-law cleared his throat before speaking, even when no one had interrupted him. Everyone behaved as though politeness was more important than truth. At the time, I mistook that for maturity. What I didn't understand was that something had already gone missing. Not an object, not a person, a truth. I remember the first moment I felt it, not as suspicion, but as unease. A conversation that stopped when I entered the room. A look exchanged across the table that didn't include me. A sentence that ended too early, like a door closed gently just before I reached it. Nothing dramatic. Nothing you could accuse someone of. Just enough to make you feel slightly misplaced in your own life. I told myself it was nothing, not because I believed that, but because believing otherwise would have required action. And action would have disturbed the calm. That was the choice I didn't know I was making. Because silence, once tolerated, becomes confident. Years passed the way they always do, quietly, and then suddenly all at once. The children grew taller. School photos turned into graduation portraits. Holidays repeated themselves until they felt rehearsed, like lines delivered from memory rather than feeling. Still, no one raised their voice. No one argued. No one fought. But no one explained anything either. Questions didn't cause arguments. They caused pauses. Smiles that arrived too quickly. Answers that felt complete, yet empty. By the 10th year, I had learned how to stop finishing my own sentences. I spoke less, not because I had less to say, but because I had learned my voice did not travel very far in that house. By the 20th year, I no longer trusted my instincts. When something felt wrong, I assumed the problem was me. My memory, my sensitivity, my age catching up before its time. By the 40th year, the silence no longer felt accidental. Felt managed. That realization didn't arrive with anger. It arrived with something colder, clarity. The kind that doesn't shout. The kind that settles into your chest and refuses to leave. Because silence is not neutral. Silence takes sides. And it was only then, standing in the same house at the same table, surrounded by the same people, that I understood something I had spent a lifetime avoiding. The silence hadn't been protecting the family. It had been protecting them. And whatever they were protecting was something they knew I could never unknow. There are days you remember because something happened. And then there are days you remember because something didn't. I didn't mark that day on a calendar. There was no argument, no raised voice, no moment dramatic enough to warn me that it would matter. It arrived like any other ordinary afternoon, quietly, politely, without urgency. That should have unsettled me more than it did. I had come home earlier than usual. The house was calm in that specific way it only ever was during the middle of the day, settled, almost forgiving. Sunlight rested on the furniture as if nothing in that room had ever been disturbed. The kind of light that persuades you to lower your guard. I went to the study for a reason I no longer remember. What I do remember is stopping halfway across the room, struck by a sensation I didn't yet have language for. Something was missing. Not furniture. Not papers scattered on the floor. Nothing visibly wrong. just absence. I opened the drawer where I kept important things, not valuables but records, letters, old documents, the kinds of items you keep not because you need them every day, but because one day you may need to remember what was promised and what was not. The drawer slid open easily, too easily. I stared longer than I should have, shifted things around, lifted stacks I hadn't touched in years. What remained was neat, almost curated, as though someone had taken time not to steal but to select. That was when the unease sharpened, because disorder would have been comforting. Disorder suggests haste, panic, mistakes. This felt rehearsed. I didn't confront anyone that day, not because I felt calm, but because I felt suddenly uncertain of my footing. Accusation requires confidence, and in that moment, mine had quietly disappeared along with whatever had been taken. That hesitation mattered more than I understood. At dinner, everyone behaved exactly as they always did. The same chairs, the same polite pauses, the same conversations that never traveled far enough to require honesty. If anyone noticed my distraction, they didn't acknowledge it. Or perhaps they did and noted it. That night, I lay awake longer than usual, replaying the study in my mind. The drawer, the careful neatness, the absence that felt shaped, not accidental. By morning, doubt had already begun its work. Maybe I moved it myself. Maybe I misremembered. Maybe it was never there. Weeks passed, then months, and with each passing week, my certainty weakened, while something else grew stronger. Decisions began reaching me already finalized. Conversations adjusted their shape depending on whether I was present. Information arrived later than it should have, softened, simplified. Time, I realized, was no longer neutral. It was working. Not for me. I checked the drawer once more, then stopped. Not because I was satisfied, but because checking had begun to feel like an admission. And admissions in that house were remembered. That was when I understood the real cost of what had happened. Silence doesn't isolate you all at once. It rearranges your life quietly enough that you don't notice until you're standing in the wrong place. Years later, I would learn exactly what had disappeared that day and why it could only be removed quietly. Loud theft invites resistance. Quiet removal invites doubt. And doubt, once planted, saves everyone else the trouble of lying. What unsettled me most wasn't the missing thing itself. It was the realization that whatever had been taken was the last thing anchoring me to the truth. After that day, I was no longer catching up. I was falling behind. Children are perceptive long before they are articulate. They register tone before meaning. They sense tension before they understand language. And they absorb silence the way lungs absorb air, continuously without question. When our children were young, I told myself they were untouched by what had begun to shape my life, that whatever had quietly disappeared years earlier had not crossed the threshold into their world. Believing that felt necessary, protective, but silence doesn't stay contained. It migrates. First, it moved gently, questions answered too quickly, stories from the past shortened, their edges smoothed until they felt safe enough to repeat. Family history presented as fragments, birthdays, photographs, milestones, while the spaces between them quietly widened. I watched our children learn when not to ask. No one instructed them. That's what unsettles me most. They learned by observation, by noticing which subjects caused adults to pause, which questions redirected conversations, which curiosities were met with warmth, and which with polite closure. That is how rules are passed down without being spoken. As they grew older, I felt something shift, not in tone but in position. Decisions involving the family reached me already formed. Plans were shared, not discussed. I was included but no longer essential. I was informed, not consulted. There was a moment, one I don't revisit often, when I almost intervened. One of my children asked a question that reached too close to the past. The room tightened. I felt it instantly. I could have spoken then. I could have corrected what I knew was incomplete. But I also knew what would follow. Not anger, not confrontation, distance. Silence, when challenged, doesn't argue. It withdraws, closes ranks. It doesn't punish loudly, it restricts access. And by then, access was the only thing I had left. So I hesitated. And hesitation, once noticed, becomes permission. Not long after, one of my children corrected me about a family memory. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't even defensive. It was casual, certain. That's not how it happened. I paused, not because I doubted myself, but because certainty had become expensive. Challenging them would have required proof I no longer possessed, and authority I no longer fully held. So I let it pass. In that moment, something subtle but irreversible occurred. My role shifted again, not through defiance but through quiet consensus. A version of the family was forming that no longer required my voice to sustain it. As years passed, I noticed my children speaking about the family using phrases I had never taught them, interpretations I had never offered, conclusions that felt finished, sealed. They weren't lying. They were repeating what had been handed to them. By the time the grandchildren arrived, the silence had matured. It no longer needed reinforcement. It lived comfortably in the family's language, passed down like manners, like etiquette, like something impolite to question. That was when urgency entered the picture. Because silence, once inherited, stops being fragile. It becomes permanent. I understood then that whatever had been removed from my life decades earlier had not only rewritten the past, it had positioned itself as the future. And with every year that passed, the cost of correction increased. Truth, delayed long enough, stops sounding like truth at all. It sounds like disruption. And I was running out of time to decide which side of that disruption I was willing to stand on. Silence doesn't hollow you out all at once. It reshapes you slowly in ways that feel adaptive at first, even responsible. You tell yourself you're choosing peace, that you're being patient, that restraint is a virtue. What you don't realize is that you are practicing disappearance. I didn't become quieter because I had less to say. I became quieter because I learned which parts of me created friction when they surfaced. Over time, those parts stopped asking to be heard. First, it felt like maturity. Then it felt like habit. Eventually, it felt like identity. I began editing myself before anyone else could. Sentences shortened before reaching my mouth. Opinions softened into observations. Certainty disguised as reflection. I learned how to speak in ways that left no residue behind. People mistake that for wisdom, but wisdom leaves traces. This left nothing. There is a specific exhaustion that comes from constant self-monitoring, from being present in conversations while standing just outside of them, from knowing when to speak and choosing not to, so often that silence begins to feel like your natural state. I noticed it in small ways. I stopped correcting people when they misremembered events I knew to be true. I let inaccuracies settle because challenging them felt disproportionate, too heavy for the room, too disruptive for the moment. Moments passed, then accumulated. Over time, I began doubting my own recollections not because they were weak, but because they were alone. Memory, I learned, needs witnesses. Without them, it doesn't disappear immediately. It erodes. That is how silence damages confidence without confrontation. From the outside, my life appeared intact.
Responsibilities met.
Appearances maintained. I was still useful, still reliable, still present. Inside, something else was happening. I became careful. Careful with words. Careful with tone. Careful with timing. Carefulness replaced conviction. And then something worse happened. I began to feel relief when decisions were made without me. Relief is dangerous because it disguises surrender as comfort. It convinces you that exclusion is ease, when in fact it is removal. That was when anger surfaced. Not loudly, not violently. Brief moments of clarity. Sharp, undeniable. When the past aligned too cleanly to ignore. Moments when it was obvious that something had been taken, something had been redirected, and something had been quietly finalized without my consent. Those moments frightened me, not because of the anger, but because anger demands response. And response in my world had consequences. So I learned to suppress even that. Silence doesn't just teach you what not to say, it teaches you what not to feel. By my later years, the damage was no longer abstract. I hesitated before speaking even in rooms where no one opposed me. I deferred instinctively even when I was the oldest person present. Even when time, by any reasonable measure, should have returned some authority to me. That was when the realization changed shape. This wasn't insight. It was an ultimatum. Because once you see how silence has altered you, you are no longer innocent in maintaining it. Awareness doesn't free you, it implicates you. And the question that followed was no longer philosophical. It was practical. How long can you remain silent? Once you understand exactly what that silence has already cost you. I didn't yet know what would force the end. But I knew something had shifted. Waiting was no longer neutral. It had become a decision. And decisions eventually come due. The thing that finally broke the silence was not anger. It was not courage. It was not even intention. It was a question, asked by someone who had no idea it was forbidden. My granddaughter was sitting at the table beside me, her legs swinging slightly as she traced patterns into the wood with her fingertip. She had inherited that habit from me, though she didn't know it. None of them did. Habits survive truths. She asked me about a photograph she had found in an old drawer upstairs. Not the drawer. Another one. It showed me younger than she had ever seen me, standing beside someone she didn't recognize. The date on the back didn't align with the family stories she'd been taught. Not quite wrong, but wrong enough to raise a question that hadn't been rehearsed. She looked at me and asked, simply, "Why doesn't anyone talk about this?" The room changed immediately. Not visibly, not dramatically, but the air tightened. I felt it before I saw it, the subtle pause, the collective stillness. Adults know how to freeze without appearing alarmed. Silence knows how to gather itself. Someone laughed lightly. Someone said it was nothing important. Another voice suggested she must have misunderstood what she was looking at. The system activated automatically. I looked at my granddaughter. She wasn't suspicious. She wasn't challenging anyone. She was waiting with the uncomplicated trust of someone who assumes the truth doesn't require strategy. For the first time in decades, the question wasn't coming from someone who could be redirected without consequence. It was coming from someone who trusted me and who would remember what I said. I felt the familiar instinct rise, the reflex to smooth, to protect the room, to return everything to its careful balance. But something else rose with it. Urgency. Because I understood then that silence was no longer only about the past. It was about inheritance, about what would survive me, about whether omission would outlive the only person who still recognized it as omission. I answered carefully, not fully, but honestly. I told her that some parts of our family's story had been simplified over time, that families sometimes choose comfort over accuracy, that silence can feel easier than truth, especially when enough years pass that correction feels impolite. No one interrupted me. That absence was deliberate. No one supported me either. That was worse. The silence didn't fight. It watched. Later that evening, the consequences began, quietly enough that someone less familiar with the pattern might have missed them. Conversations shortened when I entered the room. Decisions were shared after they were settled. Plans adjusted without explanation. Nothing hostile. Nothing overt. Just recalibration. I felt exposed, not emotionally but structurally, as if I had stepped out of an agreement I hadn't realized was still being enforced. For decades, silence had tolerated me because I was predictable, reflective, contained. I had learned its boundaries well enough to live inside them. That night I had crossed one, and silence, when crossed, doesn't react immediately. It identifies pressure points. As I lay awake, I understood something with sudden clarity. Whatever had been removed from my life years ago was no longer the only thing at risk. I had introduced uncertainty into a system built on none. The crack was small, but it had direction. And for the first time, the silence was no longer merely present. It was paying attention. Once silence realizes it has been noticed, it changes its posture. It becomes careful. That was the first thing I felt in the days after my granddaughter's question. Not anger directed at me, not confrontation, but calibration. Conversations tightened, access narrowed. Information arrived filtered, measured, delayed. That told me something important. This wasn't collective discomfort. It was coordination. I didn't begin investigating out of curiosity. I began because the system had shifted, and systems only shift when pressure is applied at a vulnerable point. I needed to know where that point was, and who stood closest to it. I started with what I still controlled. Old files. Boxes no one had touched in years because no one believed they mattered anymore. The kind of records families forget once they're confident the past has been settled. Receipts. Correspondence. Documents with dates that didn't quite align with the version of events I had been repeating for decades. Nothing dramatic at first. Just inconsistencies. Gaps where explanations should have existed. Names that appeared briefly, then vanished from the record entirely, as if their involvement had been deliberately compressed. Silence leaves patterns. It removes context, not facts. It erases reasons, not outcomes. Once I understood that, the shape of the thing became clearer. I requested copies of documents I hadn't seen since they were signed. Casually, without accusation. The way someone does when they believe transparency is routine. The delays were immediate. Polite explanations. Administrative confusion. A suggestion that some records might no longer be necessary. The responses were calm, but consistently routed through the same person. That detail mattered. For the first time, the silence had a direction. The more resistance I encountered, the clearer the outline became. What had been taken from me years ago hadn't been destroyed. It had been redistributed. Authority reassigned. Responsibility redirected. Ownership reframed. Each decision justified at the time as temporary, practical, for everyone's benefit. Temporary has a way of becoming permanent when oversight is removed. The most unsettling realization came not from what I found, but from what was missing. My consent. Documents referenced my agreement without any record that it had ever been given. My name appeared where my voice should have been. Silence had not merely removed my participation, it had substituted it. I understood then why confrontation had never been required. The system had been built to function without me. That realization didn't produce anger. Produced clarity. I made copies. Not to threaten. Not to accuse. To preserve. Evidence changes the balance even when it remains unseen. Silence survives by keeping truth fragmented. Preservation recombines it. That was when the pressure became personal. Call went unanswered. An invitation arrived late, already finalized. Concern was expressed in tones that felt less like care and more like assessment. And then came the test. I was told calmly, almost kindly, that it might be best if I let certain matters rest. That revisiting old arrangements could confuse people. That stirring questions now would only create discomfort where none was necessary. It wasn't a warning. It was a boundary. And boundaries exist for one reason, to be enforced. In that moment, I understood exactly where the silence lived, and who was willing to speak on its behalf. I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because silence had done something it never intended to do. It had acknowledged itself. I didn't yet know who would move first, but I knew where the movement would come from, and I knew something else with certainty. The truth was no longer fragile. It was documented, and silence had just revealed that it was afraid of being named. Betrayal rarely announces itself as betrayal. It introduces itself as reason. That was the most difficult truth to accept, that what had been done to me was not driven by anger or cruelty, but by agreement.
Calme discussion.
Practical decisions. A shared understanding that this was simply how things needed to be handled. Once I understood that, the pattern stopped blurring. The documents didn't contradict one another. They reinforced one another. Each decision pointed to the next. Each adjustment justified by the one before it. Authority passed hands not abruptly, but incrementally, always framed as temporary, always positioned as sensible. What unsettled me most was not the scale. It was the confidence. This wasn't theft committed in secrecy. It was removal carried out with approval. And it required coordination. I began noticing how often the same few people appeared at critical points. Not always signing. Not always authorizing. Sometimes only copied. Sometimes only present. But consistently involved where direction changed. One of them stood out, not because they acted alone, but because they spoke when the system needed a voice. Close enough to speak for me. Close enough to anticipate what I would have wanted. Close enough to reassure others when questions surfaced. They didn't erase me. They replaced me. They translated my silence fluently. Used my restraint as credibility. Positioned themselves not as decision-makers, but as interpreters, a role far more difficult to confront. And others accepted that interpretation without question. Because betrayal delivered calmly is often mistaken for stewardship. I began replaying conversations from years earlier, moments that had seemed supportive at the time, suggestions framed as concern, advice offered gently, warnings about making things complicated. I had believed those moments reflected care. Now I understood they were rehearsals. Each one tested how far authority could shift without resistance. How much could be decided without my presence. How easily silence could be mistaken for consent. Silence had not been a vacuum. It had been permission. What hurt most was not realizing that people benefited. It was realizing they believed they were entitled to. Entitled to decide what I should know. Entitled to determine when my voice was no longer efficient. Entitled to manage outcomes permanently on my behalf. And the rest allowed it because it kept things smooth, predictable, free of conflict. Silence didn't corrupt them. It rewarded them. By the time the full structure became clear, something else had changed as well. This wasn't just a system. It was a defended one. There were people whose authority depended on it remaining intact. People who intervened when questions surfaced. People who softened resistance before it reached daylight. People who would act not emotionally but procedurally if the balance was threatened. I hadn't confronted them yet. Not because I was afraid, but because once betrayal is understood at this level, confrontation stops being emotional. It becomes consequential. Speaking would not invite discussion. It would trigger response. And I knew that whatever came next would carry a cost. Not abstract, not moral, but real. Access, relationships, legacy, time. This was no longer about uncovering what had happened. It was about deciding whether I was willing to disrupt what had been built in my absence, knowing exactly who would move to stop me. That was the moment Act 2 ended. Because once you see who benefits, who protects it, and who speaks when the system is threatened, silence is no longer the danger. Choice is. People often mistake silence for submission. I understand why. From the outside, waiting looks like hesitation. It resembles fear. It feels passive, especially when others appear decisive. But silence is not always the absence of action. Sometimes it is positioning. I didn't say nothing because I was unsure. I said nothing because by then, I understood exactly what speaking would cost, and what it would collapse if done prematurely. Access was the first thing silence controlled. I had learned that long ago. Invitations thin out. Conversations shorten. Decisions begin arriving fully formed. Once that happens, you don't lose arguments, you lose visibility. and visibility was the last thing I was willing to surrender. So I stayed close. I attended gatherings, sat through conversations that circled carefully around what mattered. I listened more than I spoke, not out of habit but out of intent. Patterns emerge when no one believes resistance is coming. I watched who spoke first when uncertainty surfaced, who reframed questions as concerns, who reassured others that everything was already handled. Authority, I learned, rarely announces itself. It reveals itself through repetition. I didn't document everything, only what mattered, who intervened, who redirected, who defended outcomes that no longer needed defending. Silence had trained them to believe I was predictable, reflective, contained. That belief was useful, because it meant no one adjusted their behavior around me. No one guarded their language. No one imagined I was taking note. Waiting gave me something confrontation never could: clarity without resistance. By then, this was no longer about understanding the system. I understood it. I knew where it tightened, where it bent, and where it would break. What remained undecided was the cost. Because speaking wouldn't create discussion. It would create consequence. It would fracture arrangements that depended on discretion. It would expose roles that existed only because they were unnamed. And once exposed, those roles would not survive quietly. That was the weight of the choice. Not whether to act, that decision had already been made, but when action would do the most irreversible damage to what had been built without me. That was the purpose of waiting. Not avoidance, alignment, because when truth arrives too early, it can be dismissed. When it arrives too late, it becomes irrelevant. I was waiting for the moment when speaking would no longer be absorbed, when it would land. That moment was approaching. I could feel it in the way conversations adjusted slightly when I entered the room, in the way reassurance became more frequent, in the way certain topics were no longer raised at all. Silence sensed the shift, and so did I. The next time I broke it, I wouldn't be explaining myself. I would be changing the shape of what came after. Revenge is usually imagined as something loud. Confrontation, accusation, a moment where voices rise and masks fall. That kind of revenge is satisfying briefly, and then it's over. What I chose was quieter, because systems like ours are not undone by outrage. They're undone by accuracy. I didn't announce anything. I didn't warn anyone. I began by correcting the record carefully, and only where correction could not be undone. A document here, a clarification there, a copy sent to a place that kept records longer than families keep memories. I didn't accuse. I verified. Every action I took was small enough to appear administrative, but permanent enough to alter the structure beneath it. A signature updated, an authorization reviewed, a request submitted that required confirmation from people who had grown accustomed to operating without scrutiny. The first reaction wasn't anger. It was confusion. Processes stalled. Decisions slowed. Questions surfaced that had not been asked in years. Not because anyone was curious, but because suddenly they had to be. Silence relies on momentum. Accuracy interrupts it. I noticed the shift almost immediately. Phone calls that once arrived casually now carried caution. Conversations became precise. Language tightened. People chose their words the way I once had, aware that phrasing now mattered. The system adjusted. Not collapsing, not yet, but straining. What surprised me most was how quickly certainty disappeared. The same people who had spoken fluently on my behalf now deferred. Assurances that once ended discussions began requiring confirmation. Authority, once redistributed quietly, started drifting back toward documentation. And documentation has no memory. I didn't expose anyone publicly. I didn't need to. All I did was remove the insulation silence had provided. I let decisions remain visible long enough to be examined. That was enough. Consensus fractures quietly. No one wants to be responsible once responsibility becomes visible. I was asked politely, whether all of this was necessary. The question wasn't about truth. It was about inconvenience. That told me everything. What I had done wasn't revenge in the way people imagine it. It was restoration, restoring sequence, restoring record, restoring accountability. And accountability changes the shape of relationships. By the time the adjustments became impossible to ignore, the system was already operating differently. Decisions slowed. Authority hesitated. The smoothness everyone had mistaken for stability began to disappear. That smoothness had always been artificial. Silence had polished it. Accuracy dulled it. I didn't feel triumph. I felt balance. But balance has a cost. Because restoring the record does not restore affection. Correcting history does not preserve closeness. And removing cover does not leave everyone standing where they were before. What I returned to the record could not be managed away. But neither could the consequences of doing so. That was something no document could prepare me for. People assume that once the truth is restored, things settle. That clarity brings relief. That balance feels like peace. It doesn't. What it brings is stillness. The kind that arrives after something permanent has shifted and everyone has quietly accepted that it will not return to what it was. The first thing I lost was access. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just fewer invitations, shorter conversations, updates that arrived late, stripped of context. I was no longer excluded, I was accommodated. There is a difference. Accommodation keeps you present without keeping you close. Some relationships tightened briefly, as if by reflex. Others loosened immediately, relieved of the effort silence once required. A few ended without explanation, not angrily, not cruelly, simply finished. No one argued with me. That surprised me. There were no confrontations, no attempts to defend the old version of events. The record had settled things more decisively than any conversation could have. What changed instead was proximity. Truth doesn't always provoke resistance. Sometimes it creates distance. I became harder to speak around, harder to bypass, harder to reinterpret. And that made some people uncomfortable. I noticed it in the way my name was mentioned, less casually, more carefully. In the way conversations paused before continuing. In the way decisions were now explained instead of assumed. Respect, I learned, doesn't always feel warm. Sometimes it feels like space. The hardest cost wasn't social. It was personal. Once the silence was gone, there was nothing left to soften memory. No buffer between what happened and what it meant. I had to live with the full shape of it, not as something still unfolding, but as something complete. There is grief in that, not for what was taken, but for what will never be returned. The version of the family that existed before truth cannot be restored. Neither can the version of myself who believed harmony could survive omission. Some days I missed that man. Ignorance has its comforts, but comfort was never the same thing as dignity. I gained something as well, quietly enough that I didn't recognize it at first. I gained stillness, not the fragile stillness of silence, but the steadier kind that comes from alignment. From knowing that my presence no longer required negotiation, that my memory no longer depended on agreement to be valid. I no longer rehearse conversations. I no longer weigh every word for safety. I no longer wonder which version of the story exists without me. That freedom doesn't announce itself. It simply stays. People ask whether I would do it again, knowing what it cost. They expect hesitation. There isn't any, because the cost of truth is paid once. The cost of silence is paid every day. What I learned after 40 years of family silence is this: peace built on omission is temporary. Harmony maintained by erasure is fragile. And love that requires your disappearance is not love, no matter how quietly it presents itself. I didn't win. I didn't recover everything. But I stood inside my life without shrinking. And when the silence finally ended, I understood something with certainty. Nothing essential was lost. only what had never truly belonged to me in the first place.